know that a surprising number of objects that you use every day are thanks to accidents? Let me show you what I mean. On this episode, we discover how today's household staple started life as something quite different.
And their million-dollar idea is
plastic wallpaper.
Learn how a failed painkiller led to rave culture.
I suppose the fact that it didn't kill him is a bonus.
And find out how a kitchen spill
Someone's in trouble.
has explosive consequences.
Whoosh.
Oops, I changed the world. Do you ever feel like you've got the world on your shoulders? Like, if you don't get a break, you're going to explode? When all you want to do is just pop some bubble wrap.
Yay! Oh, sorry, did you need this for something?
This versatile packing material was never meant to be a stress-relieving plaything. But then, it was never meant to pack things either.
Would you believe that bubble wrap was originally a plan for wallpaper?
You heard that right. The story begins in the 1950s, in the bustling town of Hawthorne, New Jersey.
Tucked away in the industrial quarter of the town, engineer Alfred Fielding has his modest workshop. And he meets all kinds of people in his job every day. But one day, he meets somebody that will help him change the world.
That man is Swiss inventor and snappy dresser, Marc Chavance.
The pair immediately hit it off. Chavon's creative mind is a good match for Fielding's engineering skill, and the two decide to begin working together.
So, in 1957, they set about trying to invent a new product that they hope will bring in a little extra cash.
and their million-dollar idea is, drumroll please, wallpaper.
But we already have wallpaper.
Not just any wallpaper though, a brand new kind of plasticized textured wallpaper that would appeal to the up-and-coming beat generation. At this time, the so-called beat culture was developing all over America, but was particularly centered on the bohemian artists community of San Francisco's North Beach, Los Angeles, Venice West, and New York's Greenwich Village.
They came up with the term beat as they would be beat tired with society's norms. The beat generation took psychedelic drugs, experimented sexually, but for the large part, they rejected material wealth.
It seems like a foolproof plan. What better way to make your millions than by creating a product targeted at a subculture that specifically rejects materialism?
Cool cats reject materialism, baby.
Nevertheless, Fielding and Chavance persist with their plastic wallpaper.
Plastic wallpaper?
Yeah, plastic wallpaper.
Well, certainly goes against the conventional.
Starting with 2 plastic shower curtains, they ran them through the machine, which heated them and sealed them together.
But things don't go exactly to plan.
All this specially developed machine accomplished was creating a slightly thicker piece of plastic with lots of air bubbles trapped in the middle.
It's not actually clear whether this was something that the pair intended to do. After all, they were going for the textured look, and maybe they thought the rogue air bubbles would be the kind of texture those bohemian beats would like.
You've probably already guessed this, but it turns out no amount of liberation's enough to make you want plastic air bubbles on your walls.
As a wallpaper, this new material was a flop. Who could have predicted it?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe everyone? But strangely, they don't seem put off.
Never one to miss an opportunity, Fielding and Chavance still got themselves several patents for the equipment and the process used to make this unsightly stuff. And then they set about trying to think for a use for it.
They brainstormed more than 400 potential applications.
I wonder what they considered. Bubbled plastic clothing? Bubbled plastic bedding? Bubbled plastic houses?
Actually, that last one isn't that far off the mark. The one idea that the pair really ended up pursuing was using the new substance as insulation in greenhouses. When there is no sun, a greenhouse will lose its heat quite rapidly. So by installing insulation, you can slow the rate of heat loss.
Well, there you go. Maybe there is a use for their failed wallpaper after all.
Unfortunately, when the pair tried to use bubble wrap for this, it didn't work at all. It was another flop.
Undeterred, but with absolute and frankly irrational faith in this seemingly useless product, the pair call in the help of marketing. They've heard a little company called IBM is about to ship out their latest product, the Model T of the computing world. You know what I'm talking about. We all had posters of it on our walls growing up. The 1401 decimal computer.
This wasn't a computer as we would recognize it today. It was about the size of 2 refrigerators.
They're big and cumbersome, and yet also delicate and incredibly expensive. Sort of like a jewel-encrusted ostrich egg.
The computers were bought by large organizations like NASA to crunch huge amounts of data. And companies weren't even buying these computers, they were just renting them. It was $2,500 a month in 1960. That's about $22,000 a month in modern money.
If you're spending that much money on a device, you want to make sure that it's arriving at your office intact.
Fielding and Chavants think that their failed wallpaper could provide a solution.
And so in 1960, the Sealed Air Corporation is born, and they end up trademarking the name bubble wrap.
Up to this point, protection for shipped goods has been a lot more rudimentary. Sawdust, balled-up newspaper and horsehair were common packaging materials in the past. Bubble wrap was the packaging protection for the future.
It turns out that lots of self-contained bubbles of air are ideal for absorbing the energy from impacts. Didn't hear a crack?
Maybe not, but if you throw eggs in the studio again, I'll have to get HR involved. Anyway, in 1960, IBM take their oversized decimal computers and wrap them up in lots of bubble wrap.
It was the big break, or the pop, that bubble wrap needed.
Once the computing giant had endorsed their product, other manufacturers started to follow suit. The plastic sheet quickly becomes a shipping sensation.
With bubble wrap reaching the homes and hands of thousands around the world, something starts to happen.
The first person to pop bubble wrap was Fielding's 5-year-old son. He remembers being able to feel all of these air bubbles and not being able to resist the urge to just pop them all.
And he's not the only one.
Let's be honest, popping bubble wrap is one of life's greatest pleasures.
In 2012, a poll sponsored by Bubble Wrap itself found that 1 minute of popping could provide stress relief equivalent to a 33-minute massage. Which is nice, but also weirdly specific, like 33 minutes. Yeah, I'll take the bubbles, but if it's 34, well, you can oil me right up.
Well, now HR definitely are involved. Inappropriate.
Some researchers say that it goes back to our ape ancestors. What the sensation was like when crushing ticks and other bugs that would get in the fur.
Bubble wrap captures the fidgeting hands of people around the world. So much so, there's even a Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day. Which, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, is the last Monday in January.
So when it's still cold and dark and wet, with no sign of the end of winter, we can all collectively go and pop some bubbles to make ourselves feel better.
Today, in the UK alone, enough bubble wrap's made each year to wrap around the Earth 10 times. And the manufacture has moved on a bit from sticking 2 shower curtains together.
Bubble wrap starts life as tiny resin beads, which are melted at 450 degrees Celsius or 840 degrees Fahrenheit to form a thin resin sheet. That sheet is then flattened to the required thickness and fed through rollers that have holes in. Air is blown through the holes to form the bubbles, and then the air is sealed by applying a second sheet behind the bubble wrap.
Oh, I always wondered how they did it. The sound of popping bubble wrap booms around Denver in 2015, when the Guinness World Record for the most people popping bubble wrap is attempted.
2,681 Boy Scouts all got together from around Denver to pop the bubble wrap simultaneously.
Each was given their own section of bubble wrap, and when the whistle blew, they used their hands and feet to pop the bubbles for 2 minutes. At the end of the time, the record was theirs, more than doubling the previous record set a year earlier. Now, bubble wrap is available in a wide range of different shapes, sizes, strengths, and thicknesses. You can get big and little bubbles, wide and short sheets, and large and small rolls.
Sealed Air is a Fortune 500 company. From their humble beginnings in the 60s, they employ 15,000 people and serve customers in 122 different countries.
But bubble wrap's success is not such good news for the environment.
And we have to remember that that's not going to degrade over time, and an awful lot of that is going to end up in the natural environments, like in the oceans.
The company's worth has actually dropped a little from its peak net worth of $11 billion in 2015. Perhaps that could be a result of the world gradually moving away from plastics in packaging.
Nevertheless, bubble wrap has been a shipping institution for the last 60 years. And it's helped give birth to an entirely new era of human consumption that's reshaping our town centres. E-commerce.
E-commerce is really a phenomenon of the last 25 years. Shops no longer need to have a physical presence in towns if they can ship their goods all over the country.
With the launch of Amazon and eBay, you suddenly have an explosion of products that have to be packaged and shipped individually, rather than in bulk on a pallet. And the perfect thing to protect those packages? Bubble wrap.
Jeff Bezos, for example, the founder of Amazon, who prepared the shipments in his early days, he definitely have popped some bubbles here and there.
What started in 1960 with a 5-ton computer is now repeated in millions of homes every day. Clothes, furniture, tools, anything that you can think of, all delivered from the great merchant in the sky.
And all those packages have helped make a handful of companies very, very rich.
This is private enterprise on a vast scale, the profits from Amazon being funneled into other, sometimes quite esoteric enterprises.
Most notably, the Blue Origin's private space flights that offer to take normal people, who just happen to be worth millions, into space.
So if Amazon's e-commerce empire owes its success to the shipping institution that is bubble wrap, then in a way it's bubble wrap that's taking us to the stars.
It's a bit of a stretch, but let's run with it.
While you're sitting on your private space flight to the moon, maybe they'll give you some bubble wrap to help calm your nerves.
Coming up, the story of the kids who helped beat Hitler.
Explosives don't get much more homegrown than guncotton from wood pulp and acetone from conkers.
And how searching the cosmos becomes a lifesaver.
This was huge. The new technique was life-changingly better.
But first this. Nightlife. A place where you can lose all of your inhibitions. Often aided by a drug of choice. Be it alcohol, or perhaps something a little stronger. And while this scene can feel new and exciting, well, it isn't. Humans have been taking mind-altering drugs for thousands of years.
Incredibly, the first recorded use of psychoactive substances was found in cave paintings that probably date to around 4000 BC. That was psilocybin, or magic mushrooms.
Which means that drug taking predates tattoos, writing, and even the wheel.
And we believe that the indigenous cultures of North and South America were using this psychoactive peyote cactus around this time too.
Spanish conquistadors found the Aztecs taking magic mushrooms and having the resulting trips. The Aztecs call this flesh of the gods. As for peyote, when that got to Europe, it was considered as witchcraft.
Which is a bit of fun backstory, but let's return to those nightclubs. Because this is a story about the drug of choice for many ravers. Ecstasy. Sorry everyone, we just need to stop for a bit of a disclaimer. This is a stock shot. This person's probably eating a mint or something equally benign. There are other stock shots in this film over us talking about ecstasy. We're not saying they're drug users. They may well be drug users, but we don't know that. And you should make no assumptions either way. Okay, on with the show.
Ecstasy's origin story has become something of a legend. The story goes that the German company Merck synthesized a drug back in 1912 with the intention of developing an appetite suppressant for German soldiers.
We can only speculate on why they wanted to do this. Perhaps they wanted a way to make army food rations stretch further, but appetite suppressant or not, soldiers do still need to eat.
In fact, the army famously marches on its stomach. But something strange begins to happen to the first soldiers who try this appetite suppressant.
The soldiers whipped off their shirts and started dancing to the marching band.
To be fair to them, who amongst us hasn't whipped off their shirt for a marching band? Rousing stuff.
Apparently, the soldiers who took the drug became too calm, which is presumably not a good thing on the battlefield.
What a great story! Shame it's a load of rubbish. In the early 2000s, in true German fashion, Merck go to great efforts to set the record straight.
They go through lab reports, annual reports, patents, letters, interview records, and memoirs in search of any and all mentions of the contentious chemical.
That chemical is, of course, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Try saying that 3 times quickly.
I mean, if only there was a handy acronym for this. Oh, yes, there is. MDMA.
The historical review reveals the true origins of MDMA, and that's the story we're going to tell you now.
The first mention of MDMA did come in 1912, but not as an appetite suppressant.
Merck were trying to get around an existing blood clotting patent owned by medical giant Bayer. So they found out a way to synthesize a new chemical that was different enough to warrant a patent of its own.
So Merck make their slightly different blood clotting drug and patent both the new chemical and the various ways they found to make it.
One of the intermediate compounds, the chemicals you need to make on your way to the final compound, was methylene dioxymethamphetamine.
So MDMA was never meant to be an appetite suppressant, and it was never trialed on German soldiers. It was just a stepping stone in another process. Nobody really cares about it beyond how it can be used to make something else.
So, how did MDMA go from a step in making a, let's be honest, fairly dull blood clotting agent to being every raver's favourite nightclub stimulant? Enter a man who will later be known as the godfather of ecstasy, Dr. Alexander Shulgin.
Alexander has an insatiable interest in chemistry. When he was just 7 years old, he would ride his bicycle to the local chemical supply and ask for chemicals like sodium bicarbonate or magnesium sulfate. The druggists would put the chemicals in a paper bag and give them to the curious child, free of charge. That's definitely not something you'd be allowed to do these days.
After a failed attempt at Harvard, a spell in the Navy, and a successful stint at UC Berkeley, Shulgin ends up a Dow Chemical.
Shulgin meets with ready success in the industrial chemistry world. He invents Zectron, which is the world's first biodegradable insecticide.
This becomes one of the go-to insecticides of the 1960s.
It makes the company millions, and it makes Shulgin indispensable.
But Shulgin is really interested in a different kind of drug, the kind that alters your perception of reality.
While he was in the Navy during World War II, Shulgin was injured and he was treated with morphine. Now, he said it didn't actually take away the pain, it just made him very, very indifferent to it.
So Shulgin takes every opportunity to tinker with the molecular structures of existing drugs, often making new ones in the process.
You can imagine Dow Chemical isn't too happy with this strand of research, but given how successful Zectron has been, they grudgingly grant him time to work on his own psychedelic projects from home. Dow apparently said, "Do as you wish."
They probably should have worded that more carefully.
So Shulgin did as he wished. He did psychedelics.
In September 1976, Shulgin's tipped off by an undergraduate that a little heard of chemical compound could be worth his expert attention.
At this time, methylene dioxyamphetamine, or MDA, was a pretty popular drug on the psychedelic scene. It was nicknamed the mellow drug of America.
The student mentioned to Shulgin that they had heard of a methylated version of MDA, although nobody knew for sure what it did.
Alexander Shulgin goes home and experiments, synthesizing his own methylated version of MDA, making MDMA.
And then he took it.
Of course he did. First, he tries swallowing a 16 milligram dose, but it has no effect.
I suppose the fact that it didn't kill him is a bonus.
And what do you do if you have an unknown psychoactive drug that doesn't seem to be having any effect? Well, if you're Shulgin, you take increasingly higher doses of it.
Brave or stupid, it's hard to tell.
But eventually, at 81 milligrams, Shulgin gets his eureka moment.
After 35 minutes, he reports a smooth and nice feeling. At 45 minutes, he says the effects are still developing, but easy to assimilate. And at 50 minutes, he found himself getting quite deep, but still keeping pace.
I'm not really sure what that means. But I do know that we know all this as Shulgin's wife Anne would take notes, as well as participating herself in his experimental drug taking.
You know what they say, couples who take together, stay together. Actually, wait, no, they don't say that. That's a terrible principle to live by. Kids, don't do drugs.
That's unusually good advice.
Alexander introduces the drug to a psychologist friend, Leo Zeff, and that's when things really start to pick up for MDMA. Zeff commonly guided his patients through therapy while they were high on various drugs. He saw them as a path to enlightenment.
Follow the path to enlightenment.
By the mid-1980s, MDMA is being used widely in experimental therapy. But elsewhere, a very different use for this drug is emerging.
People start to realise that the euphoric effects of MDMA could be a lot more fun if they weren't lying on a therapist's couch. It's given the much catchier name ecstasy by a drug dealer who's keen to cash in on its potential.
Before long, MDMA is being sold at nightclubs, right alongside the beers and spirits.
Remember, this is still totally legal and very popular. Clubbers in Dallas, Texas, consume 30,000 hits of ecstasy a month.
And misuse of the drug has killed at least 5 people.
In April 1985, the US Drug Enforcement Agency moves to make ecstasy a Schedule I drug. But making it illegal doesn't seem to make much difference to its growth in popularity.
It becomes the drug of choice in the emerging rave scene. It's electronic dance music, it's flashing lights, it's MDMA, it's the ultimate escapism.
And as Dow's accidental stimulant becomes the drug of choice for this emerging scene, it becomes known by a whole host of other names.
Eve, Molly for the powdered stuff, hug drug, beans, biscuit.
I'm fairly sure you're making beans and biscuit up.
Peace, X, disco biscuit, clarity.
Whatever it's called, or however it's taken, MDMA has the same effects on the way it messes around with our brains.
MDMA causes a sudden release of 3 specific neurotransmitters in the brain. The neurotransmitters targeted by ecstasy are serotonin and, to a lesser extent, dopamine and norepinephrine. They play an important role in regulating our mood, pain levels, sleep, and appetite. The release of huge amounts of serotonin in the brain leads to widespread mood elevation, euphoria, ecstasy, if you will.
What goes up must come down, and the come downs from E can be crushing.
Lots of serotonin makes for happy users, but the problem is there's no serotonin left over for the day after. And people often would refer to Suicide Tuesday, you know, as the come down got really vicious in the days after a weekend spent taking a lot of E.
And if that isn't enough to put you off taking a handful of pills and dancing the weekend away, then maybe this will be. There's evidence that prolonged use of ecstasy can damage the brain.
Studies in primates and rodents show that the long-term binging of MDMA ends up damaging the nerve cells that contain serotonin, and that nerve damage persists for many years.
Which is interesting and a little worrying, but it does prompt an obvious question. Who is it giving drugs to monkeys? The answer, of course, is scientists. And after years in the medical wilderness, MDMA is finding its way back into the treatment rooms too.
In recent years, there's been renewed interest in trying to use psychedelic drugs to treat certain mental disorders. This is intended to speed up the development and review of promising new treatments.
This is a treatment for particularly intractable and unpleasant forms of PTSD, the kind that might be suffered by soldiers on a bloody battlefield.
As the drug opens the patient's mind, 2 therapists guide them through an 8-hour therapy session.
More than half of the patients treated this way improved to the point that they no longer fit a PTSD diagnosis, and the beneficial effects continued to increase over time. A year later, the number of people who no longer had PTSD had risen to 68%.
So, there you go. That's the story of how the precursor to a blood clotting agent accidentally became a party drug and then a potential wonder cure for diseases like depression and alcohol addiction.
It's been a tumultuous 100-year history for MDMA. It's been full of urban legends, half-truths and questionable medical ethics. So who knows where the journey for ecstasy is going to go next?
Still to come, an astronomical error.
The press jumped on this straight away, branding the Hubble the $1.5 billion blunder.
But first this. The story of explosives is one full of danger and accidents. But did you know that a whole bunch of other materials have been created in the pursuit of trying to blow things up? Let me take you on a journey that's a real blast. Sorry, couldn't resist. We are in 13th century Mongolia, and the sons of Genghis Khan have really taken to the family business.
His children have led the Mongolian armies on horseback all the way from the east coast of Russia right through to Poland, and nothing stood in their way. Historians think that up to 40 million people may have been killed during these campaigns.
As they turn their sights east to the Song dynasty in China, they face a fight like none they've ever seen before. All because of an accidental discovery made 400 years earlier in the 9th century: gunpowder.
Chinese alchemists had figured out that if they mixed charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, a compound that we know of as potassium nitrate, they could create a deadly powder that burned unstoppably.
This powder's burning, and we can't stop it!
Don't ask me, but somehow Chinese monks discovered gunpowder while looking for the elixir of life. So somehow, while looking for the secret of eternal life, they actually found out how to kill a lot of people.
So when the Mongols take up arms against the Song return the favour with fire.
They had all kinds of weapons that made use of gunpowder. There were fire arrows and fire lancers that propelled themselves, burning across enemy lines.
The Chinese had developed a method of lowering these kind of deadly iron bombs into the Mongolian trenches from above, and these were loaded with gunpowder. When they exploded, it was absolutely horrific.
The immovable force of gunpowder held back the unstoppable might of the Khans for 40 years, before finally the lines broke.
Despite everything, the Song dynasty did eventually fall to the Mongols.
The Mongols took gunpowder to India, and from there it burned a trail to the Middle East, just in time for the Crusades.
Gunpowder really democratizes warfare, because before gunpowder, wars were all about aristocratic knights on horseback being the most powerful people on the battlefield. Now, anybody with a bit of gunpowder, a gunpowder-fired weapon, could basically bring them down in seconds.
But for all its destructive wonder, black gunpowder isn't without its drawbacks.
Gunpowder's revolutionizing warfare, but of course there has to be a downside. And the thing about gunpowder is it leaves lots of smoke everywhere.
Hello? Anybody there? Hello? Anyone? This causes a whole host of issues, from not being able to see the enemy to difficulties in giving orders. And gunpowder is notoriously temperamental.
If the ingredients aren't mixed in exactly the right ratios, you'll end up with something that won't burn.
Despite trying to improve the recipe, warring nations continued to grapple with the black powder for 500 years. And then, in 1845 in Switzerland... Very nice. A new and improved explosive that revolutionises the battlefield is accidentally discovered. Its name? Guncotton.
All through the early 19th century, you've got a new generation of experimental chemists that are trying all kinds of stuff out for the first time. They're combining new chemicals, they're making new substances.
One of those scientists, a certain Christian Schonbein, is knocking a little something up in the kitchen.
Making a delicious meal?
Not unless you consider nitric and sulfuric acid a delicious meal.
So dear old Christian is boiling up a heady cocktail of nitric and sulfuric acid on the stove when...
someone's in trouble.
That's not something you want in a lab, let alone in a kitchen.
Not wishing to anger his wife, Schonbein quickly mops up his mess.
He grabs the nearest thing to mop up the spill, which happens to be his wife's cotton apron, and the fabric soaks up the acid, and Christian just hangs it by the stove to dry.
Good as new. She'll never know.
Yeah, health and safety manual here. Now, I can't see anything about mopping up cocktails of acid with your clothing.
Oh, I think you're looking at the new edition. I'm sure it used to be on page 36.
Well, either way, Christian Schonbein is relieved that a domestic crisis has been averted.
His relief is very short-lived.
Whoosh!
Without warning, the apron actually explodes in a sudden flash.
Wow! That is going to be tricky to explain.
Domestic crisis not averted.
With his quick but shoddy clean-up efforts, Schonbein has accidentally created a brand new material, which today we know as nitrocellulose.
The cotton in the apron is a natural fibre made from cellulose. Now, cellulose is sometimes known as a biopolymer because it's a really long molecule made up of chains of more than 10,000 glucose molecules all joined together.
All plants make cellulose. It's to strengthen the walls of their individual cells. And it's estimated that at least 100 billion tons of the stuff are made by plants every year.
So, when Schonbein uses the cellulose-rich cotton of his wife's apron to mop up those spilled acids, something special happens.
When the cellulose is exposed to hot nitric acid, the highly reactive nitrate groups attach themselves along the cellulose chain to make a reactive but stable compound, nitrocellulose. Christian had accidentally discovered the perfect formula for producing a highly flammable but otherwise inert material.
Christian Schonbein may be clumsy, but he's no fool. He realises the potential of his accidental discovery and sends samples to his colleagues, boasting of how he's found a way to transform cotton into a powerful explosive.
I wouldn't want to be the mailman carrying that parcel.
Schonbein carries on experimenting, refining the formula and the technique so it no longer needs spills or aprons.
So what you get at the end of the manufacturing process is something that looks a lot like cotton wool, but is way more dangerous.
Schonbein's deadly cotton wool is more powerful than gunpowder, but it also has another benefit. It's smokeless, which is quite handy when you're trying to stay hidden.
Warmongers everywhere seize Christian's invention with gusto, and they call it guncotton.
It is an immediate success. Within a year, there are factories making guncotton for artillery shells across Europe, including this one in England.
Unfortunately, in 1847, less than a year into the new guncotton venture, the factory explodes, destroying 2 buildings and killing 21 people.
That doesn't stop people trying to make guncotton at a huge scale, but I'm afraid to say, like the first factory, a lot of them go.
Schonbein's new material is about to be put to the test. When the American Civil War erupts, the Confederate shells are being powered by guncotton. But the Union Army still sees guncotton as too unpredictable and sticks with the less explosive black powder.
By the time Christian dies in 1868, gunpowder is still the go-to propellant for firearms. His invention is still a bit too dangerous.
An explosive that's too explosive. Go figure. It takes 20 years before someone finds a way to make guncotton less likely to explode while still maintaining its explosive power.
A British duo, English explosives expert Frederick Abel and Scottish scientist James Dewar, find a way to process guncotton without it exploding.
Which is great. Problem solved. But then, the guys have an even better idea.
Abel and Dewar figure out that if they combine guncotton with nitroglycerine and a little bit of petroleum jelly, they could make a powerful and reliable smokeless propellant.
They call it cordite. But to make it, this mixture needs one more ingredient. Acetone. That's right, nail polish remover. Together, this gives shells and munitions all the power of nitroglycerine, combined with the smokeless advantages of Schonbein's kitchen discovery.
This was the breakthrough the military world needed. Cordite is quickly adopted by the British Army and the Navy as their standard propellant.
The discovery of cordite was no accident. Which is a good thing, because those working in the explosives industry could do with a break from things accidentally exploding. Anyway, back to the story. When the Great War kicks off in 1914, it's cordite that rules the battlefields.
It's used in guns and torpedo warheads and grenades, and even in blasting explosives for use with bridges and mines. New naval cordite factories are opening all over the country.
Remember the nail polish remover? Well, before long, the raw materials used to make this crucial ingredient begin to run short.
The British have got plenty of guns, but they're running out of acetone, which they need in order to fire stuff out of them. Now, acetone comes from fermented wood, and it takes 100 tons of birch, beech or maple to create 1 single ton of this stuff. The problem is they need to get this wood largely from the United States, but there's a naval blockade, so they can't get the wood, so they can't create the acetone.
They need a solution, and fast. First, manufacturers try making acetone from maize, but this crop has a more urgent purpose: to feed people.
Feeding people is more important than killing them after all. The army is forced to call in a secret weapon: kids. Notices appear in classrooms across the United Kingdom, urging kids to collect acorns and horse chestnuts, or conkers to us Brits, which contain acetone.
So they earned 7 shillings and 6pence for every 100 of these they handed into the War Office. That works out at about 22 British pounds or $30 US for every 50 kilos of these they handed in.
3,000 tons of the nuts are converted to acetone to mix with the guncotton to make the cordite to get the British guns firing again.
Explosives don't get much more homegrown than guncotton from wood pulp and acetone from conkers.
The impact of explosives isn't just seen on the battlefield. Throughout the years, scientists have tinkered with this accidental explosive to create new materials, including plastics and even clothes.
Depending on how much nitrogen is added to the cellulose, the properties of nitrocellulose can vary a lot.
By mixing guncotton with ether and alcohol, you get another new material, collodion.
This collodion is a thick, clearish liquid that dries to make a flexible, plasticky solid.
This is all happening at the same time that photography is taking off, and collodion is seen as a replacement for albumin in the fixing and development of images.
It worked well, but there was one minor drawback.
Collodion is still guncotton, so the photos would be prone to going up in flames. Whoosh!
This didn't seem to put people off though, and when movies were invented, the film was made from collodion too.
The collodion film was semi-transparent and flexible enough to be wound into reels, but under the heat of the projector lamps, this nitrocellulose plastic did occasionally...
Yeah. And it was around this time that a French count called Hilaire de Chardonnay found a way of squeezing the diluted gun cotton through narrow holes to make a silk-like thread, which, perhaps unwisely, he then made into clothes.
Somewhat unoriginally, it becomes known as Chardonnay silk. This synthetic silk was actually pretty popular for a year or so, with cloaks and gowns being made of the fibres. Chardonnay even exhibited it at the Paris exhibition in 1889.
Clothes made from gun cotton? I think you can guess where this is going.
Whoosh!
Exactly. But while these descendants of Schonbein's original mixture had their issues, they heralded an era of chemical discovery that would give rise to true plastics and synthetic fabrics that
What?
don't explode. And more than a century on, nitrocellulose still has an important place in our modern world.
You find it in inks, adhesives, varnishes, and resins.
So it's even used to make fake pearls and patent leather. Have you been in my wardrobe again?
Without mankind's determination to find new and more efficient ways to blow stuff up, we'd never have had some of these amazing products.
But none of this might have come about if it hadn't been for a guilty husband trying to make amends in the kitchen.
For the last half-century, the American taxpayer has contributed around $17 billion a year to NASA. So here's a quick question. Is it worth it? And the short answer is yes, for some very good reasons.
When NASA scientists and engineers are creating new hardware for use in space, they've always got a part of their brain that's asking, how can we use this here on Earth?
If, say, you pop on your wireless headphones, clean your house, and then have a quick run on your anti-gravity treadmill, then all of these things have started in a NASA lab.
We can thank the ongoing space program for things like cordless tools, memory foam, and even cochlear implants.
But not many people know that the technology developed to enable us to see into the depths of space is now being used in the fight against breast cancer.
Whoa, that's a bit of a big leap.
It is, and also it isn't.
A core principle in any form of cancer treatment. The fact that the sooner you can cotton on to cancer being in the body, the faster you can treat it, the better.
And how does the satellite do that? Well, it's all down to the technology of imaging. In essence, seeing things that you couldn't see before. But first, let's understand the treatment of cancer.
Ancient Egyptian and Greek scholars were among the first to describe cancers, but they suggested no cure.
In the Middle East, the Islamic Golden Age brings huge developments in all forms of science, but in this case, anatomy and physiology, and in fact, medicine in general. By the time the scientific revolution happens in the West, surgical techniques and our knowledge of the human body are far more advanced than they were previously.
For centuries, the best that medicine could offer breast cancer victims was digging into their flesh and cutting out anything that looked strange.
By the 1960s, the first breast cancers were being detected by mammograms, although these only typically show up the so-called suspicious masses.
Which is better, but still not digging free.
It takes a biopsy, a physical sampling of the suspicious tissue, to even figure out whether it's cancerous or not.
What's needed is a whole new way of detecting cancer. And that brings us neatly back to a very special satellite. At 8:33 a.m. on April 24th, 1990, the Space Shuttle Discovery ascends gracefully into the skies above the Kennedy Space Center.
Space launches always give me the chills. I mean, just watching these gigantic rockets, they weigh something like 2,500 tons altogether, and they're heading straight up, almost as if they're floating.
This is the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope, which was the most complicated piece of equipment that had ever been launched into space before.
But it's so small! Oh, right, that's a model, isn't it? Yeah, I can see that now.
Telescopes on the Earth's surface are fighting a constant battle with our atmosphere, because whilst it may look transparent to our eyes, it's actually very wibbly-wobbly. It's like a novel glass. Even if you can minimize atmospheric distortions, you've still got to contend with the weather. You've got to contend with cloud.
The launch of the Hubble telescope would give NASA astronomers an unobstructed view of the cosmos 24 hours a day.
It's set to orbit the Earth at about 540 kilometers above the surface, or about 330 miles.
That puts your average home telescope to shame. It's like taking a full-scale observatory from Earth and throwing it up above the atmosphere.
The telescope, named after the astronomer Edwin Hubble, is heralded as the next generation in space exploration.
This was a huge undertaking, even for NASA. There weren't going to be people on the telescope, so the telescope itself had to stabilize itself, take an image over a long period of time, and then transfer that information back to Earth for processing.
Hubble is about the size of a school bus, and it orbits the Earth every 95 minutes.
The project cost a whopping $1.5 billion.
Just a few weeks after its launch, Hubble begins to send back the pictures that everyone's been waiting decades to see. But there's a problem.
The photos are just awful.
The stars, which should have looked to Hubble like crisp points of light, are surrounded by a fuzzy halo.
Hubble's mirror is one of the most precisely engineered, precisely ground mirrors ever created.
It's so flat that if the mirror were the size of the Atlantic Ocean, then no wave would be more than 3 inches tall.
However, it just wasn't polished to be the right shape. In order to get a super sharp image, it had to have a specific curvature, and it was ever so slightly too flat.
In fact, it's just 2,200 nanometers too flat. An error just 1/50th the size of a human hair threatens the whole $1.5 billion enterprise.
It was this small mistake that put so much of Hubble's science on hold.
Read all about it.
It's little wonder that the press jumped on this straight away, branding the Hubble the $1.5 billion blunder.
But every cloud has a silver lining. And the experts at NASA used this time to improve the design of their image sensor.
So this is now the cutting edge of this technology. It's thinner, higher resolution, that can detect all different wavelengths of visible light, and it has a really high dynamic range, which means that in one image, it can detect things that are really bright and really dim.
Now, this is the crucial bit, because it's this improved image sensor, otherwise known as a CCD, that revolutionizes breast cancer treatment.
With this new CCD chip, images can be taken at 2 different angles at the same time of the breast, which is then fed directly into the computer.
Using the NASA chips, the new technique automatically triangulates the position of a suspicious mass in real time.
With having such a precise location, surgeons are able to go in with a needle to potentially remove this area of mass, rather than having to go in and dig and try and find this part.
This was huge. Compared to what they had to do before, the new technique was life-changingly better. For a start, it can be done in a radiologist's office rather than an operating theatre.
What's more, going in with just a needle results in a tiny pinprick scar rather than a disfiguring scar that took place under the previous procedure.
And it can spot smaller masses in the breast, allowing potential cancers to be caught earlier, significantly earlier.
It's really hard to overstate the impact that this new technology has had on breast cancer treatment and diagnoses since the late 1990s. It's turned what used to be a traumatic and lengthy process into a minor procedure with a lot less to worry about.
Not only has this technology helped the fight against breast cancer, Hubble can also finally live up to its promise.
The images that the Hubble Space Telescope has sent back now are absolutely astonishing. We've seen galaxies that are about 10 billion light years away. We've seen glorious towers of nebulae where there are newborn stars forming and where old stars have died. Hubble has really shown us what a beautiful and diverse universe we truly live in.
The success of this accidental medical breakthrough is a revelation to NASA, who decide that maybe more of their tech could be usefully repurposed.
NASA now makes a thing about offering its technological breakthroughs to other industries outside of space travel.
And they may have found one in an instrument designed to detect caves and volcanoes on Mars.
This is a really sensitive instrument that's able to pick up infrared radiation, which we can essentially think of as heat.
It's so sensitive that it's able to detect a temperature variation of about 0.15 degrees Celsius.
That means that when it's used on the breast, it can detect tiny changes in heat throughout the tissue, which is caused by changing blood flow.
It's known that cancer cells emit a specific compound that alters blood flow, and blood flow usually affects temperature. And so if you're able to detect the temperature variations, you can probably detect where there might be a cancer cell located.
So, in effect, NASA's blunder has accidentally invented not one, but two different technologies that are saving lives around the world.
It's the ultimate feel-good story. Rather than being the $1.5 billion blunder, the Hubble Space Telescope ended up saving tens of billions of dollars and millions of lives.
Now, if that doesn't give you the warm fuzzies, you must be as cold and dead as space itself.